इनको बोलना है।
Yeah. Namaste. Professor Pradeep Gokhale, Honorary Professor, Department of Pali, Savitribai Phule University, Pune University. Dr. Geetesh Nirban, co-convener of the webinar series. Dear viewers, interested in Mahabharata scholarship, I welcome you all on our webinar series on Mahabharata, initiated under the project Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value of societal and political well-being. I request all of you to mute your mics. May I request all of you to mute your mics? Yeah, I welcome you all to today's lecture, which is taken up under the project Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value of societal and political well-being, taken up under the scheme for promotion of academic research and collaboration of Ministry of Human Resource Development previously. Now it is Department of Education, Government of India. Our team includes Professor Vishwa Adluri, Professor of Philosophy from Hunter College, USA, Dr. Joydeep Bagchi from Hindu University of America, USA, Dr. Geetesh Nirban, Kamala Nehru College of Delhi University, and me, Professor Bala from Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. And we are supported by two research fellows in this project, Ms. Jayshree and Ms. Anmol, and we have an extended team of supporters, Ms. Deepshika and Ms. Megha. This project, Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value of societal and political well-being. This project aims, I request all of you to mute your mic, please. The major aim of this project is to build a new approach to yoga that combines theoretical and practical perspectives. In fact, in this particular aspect, today's present lecture by Professor Pradeep Gokhale is much relevant and useful to the project. To understand the other aim that we have is to understand yoga beyond a set of postures as an overarching term for salvic practices and to see how it is embedded in social and political reality, and also to reappropriate texts of classical Hinduism which have suffered from Orientalist approaches in order to articulate the vision of yoga consciousness. And it also aims to demonstrate how answers to the question of right action at societal and political levels can be explored through the conception of yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita that transcends certain sectarian and doctrinal boundaries to create a global system of thought and practice. To explicate, the project also aims to explicate the universal and philanthropic and humanitarian aspects of Hinduism as echoed in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita. So far, we had various lectures on yoga consciousness, societal well-being, and political well-being. Today, we would be specifically dealing with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Professor Gokhale would be, as the title suggests us, would be looking at re-understanding of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. In fact, we have a narrow understanding in the contemporary times of yoga in terms of only limiting itself or reducing itself to either pranayama or to asanas. In fact, Patanjali Yoga Sutra is more wider than what we really understand today as yoga. And this necessitates a kind of re-understanding of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. And why if I have to ask this question, like, why or what needs a kind of re-understanding? One of the things that comes to my mind is when we say re-understanding, we are saying that there is a kind of form of understanding that is existent. And if we are saying that we are talking about re-understanding, it also means that this understanding that we have has some limitations or specifications which we have to overcome. So that's what necessitates a kind of re-understanding, and this requires a relook at our own past, our own Indian tradition. What happens is most of the times when we have to reach to our remote past, we often try to reach our remote past only through our immediate past, because through only our immediate past, which has constructed our epistemology, we can reach out to our remote past. And this creates a kind of problem, a tension in the understanding of the original text itself, which necessitates a kind of re-understanding among the individuals of the classical Indian tradition, and that is one of the primary things when we talk about re-understanding. Other important thing when we talk about re-understanding is we try to do a kind of active hermeneutics. When we are living and when we are leading our life, we feel that we have to make meaning to our own life of the contemporary times. And how do you do that? You reach out to your classical tradition and try to derive meaning of the present. So this active hermeneutics also necessitates a kind of re-understanding of a classical text. When I'm saying this, what I mean is when I spoke about the first one, like re-understanding, in fact, suggests that the present understanding has certain kinds of limitations. When I say that, why do I say that is specifically when it comes to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, beginning from the first verse, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, it has been interpreted variously. It's not defined, or it's not understood in only one perspective. For example, even if you take Vivekananda gives a different kind of meaning in the sense that it's restraining the mind. But some people argue that it is stopping of the chitta vrittis. Some people argue that it is cessation of the mental modification. So these three are not the same, though they look to be same. Similarly, with regard to every aspect of yoga, even Ashtanga Yoga, 8 steps that we have, there is a diverse opinion the diverse opinions are existent, diverse interpretations are existent, which sometimes for a careful reader, like by B. Wilders, you don't know which way you have to take, which kind of an interpretation that you have to really take into consideration. And it is very rich with interpretations of the Westerners as well as with the Indian traditional scholars themselves. For example, Vachaspati Misra and Vijnana Bhikshu debate on what are the samapatti. So such kind of diverse perspective, diverse and vibrant platform is available to all of us to look at and try to understand. So if we have to understand that, we have to make an effort to re-understand the text that is existent beyond the vibrant terrain that we have, and trying to have a specific and probably an appropriate kind of understanding of the classical text is definitely required. And I'm sure in this particular aspect, Professor Gokhale's talk would be very enriching to each one of us. I thank him for sparing his time, because he is a busy scholar, I know, and he has recently come out with this work, Re-Understanding Patanjali's Yoga. So, which means a scholar is with us who has authored a book on re-understanding Patanjali's Yoga to share his own thoughts, which is a privilege to all of us. We are really honored to have you with us, sir. Now I request Dr. Geetesh to proceed to introduce Professor Gokhale and take the proceedings further. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar, all of you. Before I proceed with the formal introduction of our esteemed speaker of the day, I request you all, and I make a sincere request here, to mute the audio as well as keep the videos off so that we can have a smooth flow of the session. I think nowadays this is not just a requirement, but a necessity and a kind of an ethical value that we need to follow during the whole course of webinar. That's a sincere and a very humble request to all the participants. I even request all of you to name your screen with your name and just avoid writing the number, the phone number, etc. there. we are actually conveying this for certain security reasons. And during the course of the lecture, you can all please send your questions, a bit crisp ones, in the chat box. We'll try our best to take all of them during the period that is being assigned for Q&A. I now go on to welcome our esteemed speaker. Professor Bala has already spoken about his work. In short, I would like to give you a detailed understanding of whatever Professor Gokhale has done up till now, and he's here with us. So Professor Pradeep Prabhakar Gokhale is a philosopher of eminence in India. He was awarded with his PhD for his work on fallacies discussed in ancient Indian logic, which he completed under the supervision of Professor S.S. Balinge. He taught for 31 years in the postgraduate department of philosophy at Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Since 2012, he has been Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Research Professor, Chair Professor in the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies at Sarnath. This is the post that he held till 2018. Presently, he is an honorary adjunct professor in Department of Pali at Savitribai Phule University. He has authored 6 books in English and 5 books in Marathi. He has edited 2 books in English, co-edited 2 books in English, and 2 books in Marathi. He has 10 research articles published in foreign research journals, 21 articles in Indian research journals, and 31 articles in other collections and anthologies. He has more than 75 articles in Marathi published in academic journals, popular journals, and other collections and volumes. The areas of his research interest are classical Indian philosophy and logic, social philosophy, philosophy of religion, Ambedkar studies, and contemporary Buddhism. He has been associated in the capacity of editor with 3 quarterly philosophical journals, the Indian Philosophical Quarterly, Paramarsh in Marathi, and Paramarsh in Hindi. And as Professor Bala just mentioned, his latest book that has been published by Routledge in just last month, that is July 2020, is named as the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, with the subtitle as A New Introduction to a Buddhist Roots of the Yoga System. Well, I'm sure he's going to touch upon lots of points from this book for all of us. So today he's delivering the address on the topic, which is often discussed and analyzed in the present times, the very yoga philosophy. So here we have with us Professor Gokhale addressing on the topic, Re-Understanding Patanjali Yoga. I now hand it over to Professor Gokhale to begin with his presentation. Has he
Hello, namaskar to everyone.
Namaskar.
Friends, today I would like to share with you my views on Patanjali's yoga. My paper is divided in 2 parts. In the first part, I will try to show how Patanjali's yoga system as manifest in the Yoga Sutra is influenced by Buddhism. And in the second part, I will try to question the view of some scholars that Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya form a single uniform system. I will highlight there the discrepancies between the 2 texts. So part 1, there are many issues about the system called Patanjali Yoga. Patanjali Yoga means the yoga system of Patanjali. Patanjali in this context is regarded as the author of Yoga Sutra. A popular tradition identifies Patanjali, the author of Yoga Sutra, with the author of Vyakarana Mahabhashya and that of Charaka Samhita. A prayer is often recited in the yoga classes which identifies the three Patanjalis, which says, Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakarottam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi. I bow down with folded hands before Patanjali, who removed the dirt of mind through yoga, dirt of speech through grammar, and the dirt of body through medical science. But there is no evidence to show that the author of Charaka Samhita must be the same as the Patanjali of yoga. Similarly, the thesis which identifies the Patanjali of Yoga Sutra with the author of Vyakarana Bhashya is also doubtful. Here I agree with J.H. Woods, who holds that the identification of the two Patanjalis is not confirmed by a comparison of their philosophical concepts. Modern scholars even question the identity of Patanjali as the author of Yoga Sutra. They point out that the name Patanjali is found in some later commentarial works. It is not found in the Yoga Sutra itself or in its earliest commentary, Yoga Bhashya. This issue of the identity of Patanjali also has implications for the question of his period. In fact, we can notice three major trends among the yoga scholars on this issue. They can be termed as extremely orthodox, quasi-orthodox, and modern, respectively. According to the extremely orthodox view, Patanjali must have been prior to the Buddha. This view identifies Vyasa, the commentator of Yoga Sutra, with Veda Vyasa, who divided Vedas into 4 parts, whose period is said to be around 3rd millennium BCE, and then Patanjali becomes still prior to him. This view is more dogmatic than the one based on evidences. According to the quasi-orthodox view, the Patanjali of Yoga Sutra is identified with the Patanjali of Vyakarana Mahabhashya. This view would place Patanjali in the 2nd century BCE. However, as suggested above, there is no strong evidence for maintaining the identity of the two Patanjalis. The general trend among modern scholars is to consider Yoga Sutra to be contemporaneous with the Vasubandhu's work, Vasubandhu, a Buddhist philosopher. That is because some aphorisms in the 3rd and 4th chapter of Yoga Sutra contain a response to Vasubandhu's discussion of Sarvastivada. And some aphorisms in the 4th chapter contain a criticism of the idealist Buddhist doctrine of consciousness only, Vijñapti Matrata. Accordingly, Patanjali's period is ascertained as the latter half of the 4th century CE. This brings us to the first main theme of the paper, influence of Buddhism on Patanjali's yoga. Though the yoga system of Patanjali is often described as Patanjala Sankhya, many ideas which are not found in traditional Sankhya but are found in Buddhism are found in the yoga system. According to Erich Frauwallner, yoga, which can be called the practical way of Sankhya, borrowed its important new ideas from Buddhism. Scholars like Lavale Poussin had identified many locations in Yoga Sutra and also Yoga Bhashya where Buddhist influence is undeniable. In fact, Patanjali's yoga can be understood as amalgamation of the materials taken from diverse sources. The question can be asked here as to what could be the background literature of Yoga Sutra. Sutra literature of any school is generally understood as crystallization or abbreviation of the background literature which is already available. For example, Mimamsa Sutra, for that the background literature is Brahmana literature. For Brahma Sutra, the background literature is Upanishads. For Nyaya Sutra, the background literature can be found in as the discussion of Vada in the texts like Charaka Samhita. Similarly, Vaisheshika Sutra, the background literature can be seen in the discussion of the Vaisheshika categories in Charaka Samhita. Then Tattvartha Sutra of Umaswati, the background literature is Jaina Agama literature. And now the question is, what is the background literature of Patanjali Yoga Sutra? Unlike other sutra texts, the Yoga Sutra does not seem to have a uniform background literature belonging to a single tradition. It seems to have diverse literature as its background, which includes classical Upanishads, Sankhya, as well as the Buddhist and Jaina literatures. Among these influencing sources which form background of yoga, Upanishads and Jainism play rather fragmentary and limited role. Comparatively, the influence of Sankhya and Buddhism is pervasive and thoroughgoing. Now, influence of Upanishads, it is possible to argue that Patanjali derives some of its yogic ideas from Upanishads. For example, Kathopanishad describes yoga as a fixed state of sense organs and mind. Patanjali's concept of yoga, which consists of stoppage of the functions of mind, could be partly a development over the above concept. Similarly, the Upanishadic ideas such as the highest Purusha and the syllable Om seem to have influenced Patanjali. The influence of Jainism. The Jaina influence on Patanjali is visible in the latter's description of the first limb of the 8-limb yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, which is called Yama, restraint. The 5 yamas, namely Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, and Aparigraha, and their characterization as great bhav, Mahavrata, tallies with the Jaina concept of Mahavrata with its 5-fold classification. More important source of Patanjali Yoga than Upanishads and Jainism is, of course, the Sankhya system. Patanjali's yoga uses many Sankhya as Purusha, Drashta, Guna, Viveka, Kaivalya, Pratiprasava, and Sattva in the way in which classical Sankhya uses them. The distinction between Purusha on the one hand and Prakriti and its gunas on the other is strictly maintained in Yoga Sutra. In fact, Patanjali seems to accept the classical Sankhya as the framework in which he arranges different yogic concepts. This is the reason why Patanjali's yoga is sometimes called Patanjala Sankhya. But in spite of such a close similarity, there are 2 important differences between classical Sankhya and Patanjali's yoga. The classical Sankhya is concerned with the genesis and the structure of the universe as well as psychology and soteriology. But while using Sankhya ideas, Patanjali is concerned with the psychological and soteriological elements of Sankhya rather than its cosmological elements. Secondly, the classical Sankhya has no place for the concept of Ishvara, whereas it is an important concept of Patanjali's yoga. It should be noted here, however, that though Patanjali's yoga contains the concept of Ishvara, the Ishvara of Patanjali is not God in the sense of the creator of the world or even the efficient or material cause of the world. Though Patanjali must have been influenced by both Sankhya and Buddhism, he was not influenced by them in the same order and manner. This is because there is a basic contrast between the 2 systems. The Buddhist philosophy is essentially non-eternalistic, whereas Sankhya, in its ultimate analysis, is eternalistic. Sankhya allows 2 types of eternality: absolute eternality, that is Kutastha Nityata of Purusha, and transformational eternality, Parinami Nityata of Prakriti. Here we can say that Patanjali, while synthesizing the 2, gave ultimate authenticity to Sankhya metaphysics. Insofar as the influence of Sankhya is concerned, Frau Wallner claims that it must have been the school of Sankhya developed by Varshaganya, which influenced the yoga of Patanjali. Similar question can be raised about the Buddhist influence on Patanjali. We can ask, which Buddhist literature or Buddhist tradition might have influenced Patanjali, from which he derived various Buddhist terms, concepts, and doctrines? S.N. Tandon, in his book, A Reappraisal of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras in the Light of the Buddha's Teachings, suggests that the early Buddhist tradition, namely the Pali tradition, must have been available to Patanjali. Tandon, in his book, points out many points of close similarity between Pali Buddhism and Yoga Sutra. On the other hand, Lavale Poussin, in his article Buddhism and the Yoga of Patanjali, has compared aphorisms of yoga with Abhidharma Kosha as well as Pali Buddhism. Here it seems more likely that the Buddhist source literature which has influenced Patanjali was the Sanskrit Buddhist literature rather than the Pali literature. The Sanskrit Buddhist literature consisted of Vasubandhu's works such as Abhidharma Kosha and Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Similarly, Yoga Sutra is also a response to Asanga's creation of a yoga system in the form of Yogachara Bhumi texts, which was based on the Buddhist theory of self-disciplining and meditation. Here, the scholars like Frau Wallner, hence the scholars like Frau Wallner and Gerald Larson advance the historical claim that the Yoga Sutra represents a hybrid formulation, a conflation of old Sankhya philosophy and old meditation traditions such as Buddhism. Apart from this historical claim, another relevant point here is that the Yoga Sutra can be best understood only on the background of Buddhist soteriology and the theory of meditation. Many terms in Yoga Sutra can be better understood only on the Buddhist background. They are not found in that form in the yoga, in the non-Buddhist sources. To cite a few, Nirodha, Klesha, Vikalpa, Asampramosha, Vitarka, Vichara, Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna, Mrudu, Madhya, Adhimatra, Pranidhana, Sthyan, Vikalpa, Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, Upeksha, Samapatti, Smriti Parishuddhi, Adhyatma Prasad, Prajna, Bija, Anushaya, Heya, Heya, Hetu, Hana, Hanopaya, Pratipaksha Bhavana, Vyuthana, Dharma Parinama, Lakshana Parinama, Avastha Parinama, Nirmana Chitta, Viveka Nimna, Kaivalya Pragbhara, and Akusida. The Buddhist influence is not limited to the terminology, but it encompasses the whole empirical psychological theory of suffering, emancipation, and the path of morality and meditation developed by Buddhism. This point can be explained by focusing on the 4 pillars of yoga by comparing them with the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. We know that the Buddha presented his philosophy of life by using the categorical framework of 4 noble truths. Patanjali adopts the framework with a different but parallel terminology. So Buddhist terminology is dukkha, dukkha samudaya, dukkha nirodha, and marga. And Patanjali's terminology is heya, heya hetu, hana, and hanopaya. Patanjali defines heya, the thing to be abandoned, as suffering yet to come. While explaining the other 3 categories, he uses Sankhya metaphysical concepts. Accordingly, the cause of heya, that is heya hetu, is the union of the seer and the seen, that is Purusha and Prakriti. Hana, that is abandonment of suffering, is nothing but their disunion. And hanopaya, that is the means to this abandonment, is the discriminating knowledge, viveka khyati. But Patanjali must have been aware of the limitation of this Sankhya style metaphysical explanation of suffering, its causes, and its remedy. Hence, through many aphorisms of Yoga Sutra, he gives empirical psychological explanation, which is largely based on Buddhism. So, explanation of suffering. According to the Buddhist explanation of suffering, everything is an object of suffering in either of the 3 ways. Dukkha dukkhata, that is, certain things are objects of suffering because they are painful in themselves. Viparinama dukkhata, certain things are objects of suffering because they result into suffering. And samskara dukkhata, certain things are objects of suffering because they are composite samskara in nature. Hence are subject to destruction. This 3-fold explanation of suffering is called the doctrine of Trividha Dukkhata. Following this Buddhist understanding, Patanjali maintains in Yoga Sutra 2.15 that everything is an object of suffering according to a wise, discriminating person. Here he supports this thesis by giving an explanation in terms of Trivida Dukkhata when he says Parinama Tapa Samskara Dukkhaihi in that aphorism. So second noble truth, the cause of suffering. Just as Patanjali adopts the Buddhist explanation of the nature and kinds of suffering, he also adopts the Buddhist analysis of the origin of suffering. In Yoga Sutra 2.3 to 2.15, he gives a causal explanation of suffering in terms of kleshas, defects or defilements of mind, which is largely empirical and influenced by the Buddhist explanation. The 5 kleshas accepted by Patanjali closely resemble the anushayas or dormant kleshas or kleshas as they were accepted by Asanga and Vasubandhu. So here is a chart in which in one column I have given the 6 anushayas or kleshas as given by Asanga and Vasubandhu, and in the second column I have given the 5 kleshas or defilements of Patanjali, and I have shown how they go parallel to each other. So in Buddhist classification, we have avidya, misconception. In Patanjali's classification also we have avidya. Then second anushaya or klesha in Buddhist classification is mana, ego or pride. And in Patanjali's classification, we have asmita, which is also understood as ego. Then raga, third anushaya in Buddhist classification, raga, third anushaya, third klesha in Patanjali's classification. Then in Buddhist classification, we have pratigha, which means hatred. In Patanjali's classification, we have dvesha. Then next one is drushti in Buddhist classification, which means dogmatic view. And in Patanjali's classification, we have abhinivesha, which is also interpreted as drushti or dogmatic view in Buddhist classification. And then we have vichikitsa in the list of anushayas or kleshas in Buddhism. Corresponding to that, there is no klesha accepted by Patanjali, but although Patanjali does not give the status of klesha to vichikitsa, he includes it in the antarayas elsewhere. Now, among the 5 defilements, the first defilement is avidya, misconception, which is regarded as the ground of all defilements. Avidya kshetram uttaresham. Patanjali defines it as wrongly conceiving of impermanent as permanent, painful as pleasant, non-self as self, and impure as pure. This is the typically Buddhist conception of viparyasa. And the Buddhist conception of viparyasa is also closely connected with their concept of avidya. The last 3 defilements, abhinivesha, that is desire, aversion, and it is also interpreted, abhinivesha is interpreted as love of life. They are comparable with 3 kinds of craving: trishna, that is kama trishna, that is craving for pleasure; vibhava trishna, craving for destruction; and bhava trishna, craving for continuation of life. Buddhism often talks about 2-fold cause of suffering, avidya and trishna. Here we find that the 5 kleshas cover both these causal factors. Now we come to the third noble truth. Sorry. Cessation of suffering. Cessation of suffering can be called the ultimate goal to be reached. In Sankhya, it is called Kaivalya, and in Buddhism, it is called Nirvana. Kaivalya in Sankhya is generally understood as the transcendental metaphysical state, whereas Nirvana in Buddhism is a more empirical psychological state, though Buddhists also try to give it a transcendental status. Patanjali avoids the word Nirvana, but he talks about the ultimate goal as Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which closely resembles Nirvana. Now, let us consider this term Chitta Vritti Nirodha, and there is a parallel term in Buddhism, Saudhnya Vedayita Nirodha. Abhidharma Buddhism describes the highest state of meditative trance as Saudhnya Vedayita Nirodha, cessation of perception as well as sensation, which is also described as Chitta Vritti Nirodha, cessation of, Chitta Chaitya Nirodha, cessation of minds and mental states. Patanjali's conception of Chitta Vritti Nirodha is parallel to Chitta Nirodha of Buddhist Abhidharma. It may be noted that for some Vaibhashikas like Bhadanta Vasumitra, there is no cessation of mind in Nirodha Samapatti. It seems that for Patanjali, in meditative trance, there is pure Chitta without modification. This pure Chitta is a reflection of the seer in his original state. Now we come to another conception of ultimate goal as Nirbija Samadhi. Patanjali also describes the ultimate goal as Nirbija Samadhi, seedless trance. Bija, according to early Yogacara Buddhism, stands for Alaya Vijnana, store consciousness, which consists of latent impressions, that is vasanas. Alaya Vijnanam Bija Shrayaha, Yogacara Bhumi. Nirbija Samadhi in this sense is the state of trance in which there are no latent impressions. Now we can also talk about Rutambhara Prajna in this context. Patanjali also describes the spiritually highest state of a person in terms of what he calls Rutambhara Prajna, truth-bearing wisdom. In fact, it is the penultimate condition. It arises from the practice of Sabija Samadhi and leads the aspirant to Nirbija Samadhi. This wisdom is a direct insight into the true nature of things. It is different from both scriptural understanding, that is Shruta Prajna, and intellectual understanding, Anumana Prajna. Patanjali derives this threefold classification from the Buddhist classification of Prajna into Shrutamayi, Chintamayi, and Bhavanamayi. For Buddhists too, Bhavanamayi Prajna is the direct insight into the true nature of things, which arises from the practice of meditation, Bhavana. Now we come to the fourth noble truth, means or path to the cessation of sufferings. Though Patanjali makes a straight statement that unwavering discriminating knowledge is the means to the cessation of suffering, Viveka Khyatihi Aviplava Anupayaha. In the succeeding aphorisms, he gives the details of this means in terms of eight-limbed yoga, Ashtanga Yoga. The Buddhist path towards the cessation of suffering is also eight-limbed, Arya Ashtangika Marga. There is no one-to-one correspondence between the limbs of the two paths. However, there is an essential similarity between the two. A broad point of similarity between the two approaches to the path is that they understand the path to be the path of purification. In Buddhism, it is called the path of purification, Visuddhimagga. And in Patanjali Yoga, it is called the means to destruction of impurities, Yoganga Anushtana, Ashuddhikshaye, etc., etc. Secondly, both the paths can be mapped on the threefold model of Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, that is morality, concentration, and wisdom. The eight limbs of the Buddha's path are right understanding, right thoughts, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right efforts, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Out of them, the first two, namely right understanding and right thoughts, are subsumed under Prajna, wisdom. The next three, that is right speech, action, and livelihood, can be subsumed under Shila, morality. And the last three, that is right mindfulness and right concentration, can be subsumed under Samadhi, that is concentration. In actual practice of spiritual development, the order can change. Their morality can come first, then concentration, and then wisdom. The 8 limbs of Patanjali's yoga are restraints, yama, observances, niyama, posture, asana, regulation of breath, pranayama, withdrawal of senses, pratyahara, fixed attention, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and deep concentration or trance, samadhi. Out of them, the first two, that is yama and niyama, can be broadly subsumed under morality or shila. The last three, that is dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, can be subsumed under concentration, that is samadhi. The third in the middle, namely, the three in the middle, namely asana, pranayama, and pratyahara, can be understood as preparations for concentration. In Patanjali's 8-limbed yoga, prajna or its equivalent is not mentioned directly, but as we have seen, Rutambhara prajna is regarded as the result of the constant practice of sabija samadhi, and it is also regarded as the road to nirbija samadhi. So prajna can be regarded as implied, though not explicitly stated, in the 8-limbed yoga of Patanjali. Many other similarities between Patanjali Yoga and Buddhism have been pointed out by scholars such as Lavale Pusa and S.N. Tandon, and I have pointed out many in my book on the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. We will make a selective survey of them in the next 3 slides. In Yoga Sutra, we have already seen that there is 4-fold Yoga Shastra, Heya, Heya, Hetu, Hana, and Hanupaya. And in Buddhist literature, we have 4 noble truths, Dukkha, Dukkha Hetu, Dukkha Nirodha, and Marga. Now, in Yoga Sutra, it is said that there are 5 means or 5 upayas, namely Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, and Prajna. The same 5 are included in Buddhist soteriology as 5 balas and or sometimes 5 indriyas. Then in Yoga Sutra, we have 4 bhavanas, Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, and Upeksha. The same 4 are called in Buddhist literature as apramanas or immeasurables or brahmaviharas. In Yoga Sutra, there is a classification of karma into black, white, both and neither. Krishna, Shukla, both and neither. And we have the same division in Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Then in Yoga Sutra, we have 3-fold dukkha. We have already seen that parinama, tapa, samskara, and the same is included in Buddhist literature as Trivida Dukkhata. Then we have already seen that there is 5-fold classification of kleshas in Yoga Sutra into avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. And in Buddhist literature, we have 6-fold classification of kleshas, avidya, mana, raga, pratigha, drishti, and vichikitsa. We have also seen the concept of avidya in Yoga Sutra and the concept of avidya or viparyasa in Buddhist literature are identical. Then in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, there is a talk of Sampradnyata Samadhi is understood as a kind of meditation on Rupa of Vitarka, Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita. And corresponding to that, in Buddhist literature, we have Rupa Dhyana, which consists of 5 elements, Vitarka, Vichara, Priti, Sukha, and Upeksha. In Yoga Sutra, we have 3-fold Prajna, Shruta, Anumana, and Rutambhara. In Buddhist literature, we have 3-fold Prajna, Shrutamayi, Chintamayi, and Bhavanamayi. In the Yoga Sutra, there is a talk of Dharma Megha Samadhi, which is regarded as the highest stage. And in Buddhist Mahayana literature, in the Bodhisattva Bhumi, there is a talk of 10th Bhumi called Dharma Megha Bhumi. In Yoga Sutra, while explaining change or transformation in a thing, there is a talk of 3 types of parinama, dharma parinama, lakshana parinama, and avastha parinama. And in Buddhist literature, while discussing Sarvastivada views, Vasubandhu talks about dharmanyathika, lakshananyathika, avasthanyathika, and anyathanyathika as 4 types of Sarvastivadins. Then degrees of application of means are mrudu, madhya, and adhimatra. The same terminology is used in, we find in Buddhism. Then 5 ways by which supernormal powers are achieved. In Yoga Sutra, it is said that these are the 5 means, 5 ways: birth, drugs, mantra, austerity, and meditation. And the same 5 are found in Abhidharma Kosha also. In Yoga Sutra, many supernormal powers arise in a yogin from perfection in meditation. So that is Sanyama. So the term Sanyama is not there in Buddhism, but Parishuddha Dhyana. So many supernormal knowledges and powers, which are called Abhidnya and Ruddhi, arise from extremely pure meditation. Then supernormal powers are obstacles in the achievement of final goal. That is what Yoga Sutra says. In Buddhism also we find the same idea. The Buddha warned his disciples not to be engaged with practicing supernormal powers. So with this, we come to the second part, the question of the relation between Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya. This discussion I'm particularly introducing because it will also throw light on the some concepts of Yoga Sutra itself. While understanding the Yoga of Patanjali, one has to face the problem of the relation between Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya. Here there are 2 types of views, traditional and modern. According to the traditional view, the sage Patanjali, who was the author of Yoga Sutra, and Bhagavan Vyasa, who was also called Veda Vyasa, who wrote Yoga Bhashya, are 2 different personalities. Vyasa Bhashya is regarded as the authentic commentary on Yoga Sutra. Modern scholars have diverse views on the relation between Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya. Like traditionalists, modern scholars also generally look at Yoga Bhashya as the most useful source for interpreting Yoga Sutras. Sometimes, however, they raise some doubts about the authenticity of the interpretation provided by Yoga Bhashya. For example, the yoga scholars George Feuerstein and J.W. Hauer had reservation about the commentators of Yoga Sutra, including Vyasa, that instead of presenting the genuine philosophy of yoga, these commentators often foist on yoga the philosophy of Sankhya, and that for this reason, they are to be used with caution. Similarly, Bronkhorst raises a doubt about the Bhashyakara, that his skills were primarily or even exclusively theoretical, and that he may not have had any direct experience of yogic states. In another paper, Bronkhorst observes that Yoga Bhashya was never meant to be representative of anything but the Sankhya philosophy. Bronkhorst, however, is not consistent on this point. Sometimes he expresses a contrary possibility that Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya are not 2 distinct entities, rather the author of Yoga Bhashya himself might have authored the Yoga Sutra. Another important yoga scholar, Philip Maas, develops a thesis through his works that Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya are not 2 different texts, but a single text, which was called Patanjali Yoga Shastra. The latter, according to him, is the result of a single, roughly datable philosophical authorial intention. His thesis also implies that probably the same author wrote both the sutra and its commentary. I'm not inclined to accept the view that Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya constitute a single uniform text. I hold that though the Yoga Bhashya is a very useful device for understanding the import of Yoga Sutra, there are some important points on which the Bhashya does not seem to reflect the intended or implied meaning of the sutra. I would like to mention here 4 major themes on which there are glaring discrepancies between Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya. These 4 themes are: 1, the 2 classifications of Samadhi, Ishvara and Ishvara Pranidhana. 3. Asana and Pranayama. 4. 4 bhavanas, that is Maitri, Karuna, Mudita and Upeksha. So the first theme, 2 classifications of Samadhi. In the first chapter of Yoga Sutra, Patanjali introduces 2 classifications of meditative absorption. In that is Samadhi. In Yoga Sutra 1.17 to 17 and 18, he introduces the first classification into Sampradnyata and Asampradnyata, which of course Vyasa calls Asampradnyata. In Yoga Sutra itself, it is just called Anya, that is with object consciousness and without object consciousness. This classification is based on the presence or absence of form or object of meditation. In Sampradnyata Samadhi, one meditates on a form or the nature of gross thought, vitarka, or subtle thought, or bliss, ananda, or the notion of self, asmita. In Asampradnyata Samadhi, one practices meditation on cessation of form, virama pratyaya. This classification is comparable with the Buddhist division between Rupa Dhyana and Arupa Dhyana. Towards the end of the same chapter, Patanjali introduces another classification of Samadhi that between Sabija and Nirbija, with seed and without seed. Here the seed is supposed to be that of samskaras, latent impressions. The 2 classifications are different and they are also not isomorphic with each other. Patanjali's definition of Asampradnyata Samadhi shows that there is the residual of samskaras in that Asampradnyata Samadhi, samskara sheshaha anyaha. That is what he says. On the other hand, while explaining Nirbija Samadhi, he says that it is attained when all the samskaras are destroyed. This implies that Asampradnyata Samadhi and Nirbija Samadhi are different according to Patanjali. Vyasa, however, wrongly identifies the 2 types of Samadhi. In order to justify this identification, he translates Sabija Samadhi as the Samadhi having external object as the seed, Bahirvastu Bija, which is quite unnatural. Interpretation of Bija as latent impressions is more natural and also seems to be authentic. Here, Vyasa's identification of the 2 classifications of Samadhi does not reflect the true import of Yoga Sutra. Now I come to the second discrepancy, Ishvara and Ishvara Pranidhana. After defining Sampradnyata and Asampradnyata Samadhi in Yoga Sutra 1.17-18, Patanjali in the following aphorisms till 1.39 introduces different ways and means of achieving Samadhi, removing obstacles, and achieving tranquility and stability of mind. In this context, he introduces Ishvara Pranidhana as an important means of achieving Samadhi. Patanjali defines Ishvara as a special kind of Purusha, Purusha Vishesha, which is free from defilements, actions, and latent impressions. Being full of consciousness, it is said to possess the seed of omniscience. And being ideal state of consciousness, it is also described as the teacher of teachers, that is the source of instruction for all. Ishvara can be an object of meditation, not directly, but through the symbol Om. This meditative practice based on the recitation of Om has special advantages. They are achievement of Samadhi and removal of psychological obstacles or impurities. Patanjali calls this practice of meditating on Ishvara as Ishvara Pranidhana. The word Pranidhana used by Patanjali is in need of explanation. The term does not have any specific meaning in the Vedic or Sankhya tradition, but it has a special meaning in the context of Buddhist spiritual practice. Accordingly, Pranidhana means earnest desire or resolve. For example, according to Mahayana Buddhism, Bodhisattva, that is the aspirant of Buddhahood, makes a resolve, Pranidhana, that through moral spiritual practice, he or she will become the Buddha. This meaning of the term Pranidhana is relevant to Patanjali's concept of Ishvara Pranidhana. Hence, the term Ishvara Pranidhana can mean the resolve of the seeker to purify his mind completely and become like Ishvara. It should be noted here that Patanjali describes Ishvara as ideal Purusha, not as creator God. He describes him as the seed of omniscience, not as the omnipotent being. Hence, the term Ishvara Pranidhana cannot have the connotation of theistic practice or devotional practice. But Vyasa gives a theistic turn to Patanjali's concepts of Ishvara and Ishvara Pranidhana. He describes Ishvara Pranidhana as a special kind of devotional practice, Bhakti Vishesha, while commenting on Yoga Sutra 1.23. While commenting upon Yoga Sutra 2.1, Vyasa defines Ishvara Pranidhana as surrendering all actions to Ishvara or sacrificing fruits of all actions. Such a theistic devotional connotation of Ishvara Pranidhana is inconsistent with the concept of Ishvara as a Purusha, which is just pure consciousness and untouched by defilements, actions, fruitions, and latent impressions. Now I come to the third theme of discrepancy between Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya, that is asana and pranayama. It is well known that Patanjali in Yoga Sutra introduces what is called 8-limbed yoga or Ashtanga yoga. The third and fourth limb among the 8 are asana and pranayama. These limbs are shared by another form of yoga called Hatha yoga. But it is a debatable question whether asana and pranayama of Patanjali's yoga system can be identified with those of Hatha yoga. Though Patanjali yoga and Hatha yoga accept liberation as the ultimate goal, the orientations of the two yogas are different. The main thrust of Hatha yoga is regulation of bodily functions and purification of channels, nadi shodhana, through the practices of asana, pranayama, bandha, and mudra. The spiritual aim of these practices is arousal of the power called Kundalini, and the liberation is supposed to be attained through that. In Hatha Yoga texts, we come across a series of asanas having different bodily advantages, and under pranayama, we come across different ways of controlling breath with different supernormal results. The practice of pranayama consists of controlling breath through artificial stoppage or forced activity. Although Patanjali also includes asana and pranayama as important aspects of it, let us first consider asana. Generally, the asanas in Hatha Yoga are difficult. They are attained strenuously or by force. In contrast, Patanjali defines asana as a stable and comfortable state, sthira sukham asana. He correlates the concept of asana with two other aspects, prayatna shaithilya, relaxation of efforts, and ananta samapatti, meditative attainment of an infinite object. This implies two things. Asana is a vehicle to meditative attainment, and that any stable and comfortable position of body can be called asana. It is doubtful whether Vyasa followed this insight of Patanjali in his commentary. While explaining Yoga Sutra definition, Sthira Sukham Asanam, Vyasa does not treat Sthira Sukha as the definition of asana, but as an example of asana. He gives an open list of 13 asanas, Padmasana, Virasana, Bhadrasana, Swastika, Dandasana, Sopashraya, Paryanka, Krauncha Nishadana, Hasti Nishadana, Ushtra Nishadana, Samasamsthana, Sthira Sukha, and Yatha Sukha. In this list, Sthira Sukha is just an example of asana and not the defining characteristic of all asanas. This suggests that while interpreting Patanjali's notion of asana, Vyasa confuses between definition and instantiation, and while giving examples of postures, he could be under the influence of Hatha Yogic concept of asana. There is a similar problem about pranayama. Patanjali defines pranayama in Yoga Sutra 2.49 as tasmin sati shvasa prashvasa yoho gati vichhedah pranayama. When asana is established, pranayama means gati vichheda of in-breathing and out-breathing. Here the word gati vichheda is a key term. Vichheda means separation or distinction, distinct cognition or distinct manifestation. This meaning is clear from the way Patanjali has used the verb vichheda in another aphorism, in aphorism number 2.4. Here he has used the word vichinna, derived from the same root, to refer to the manifest state of the defilement. So there he used the classification of kleshas, where he talks about vichinna, tanu and udara and so on. Hence, gati vichheda would mean distinct cognition of motion, and pranayama would mean distinct cognition of the motion of in-breathing and out-breathing. Hence, while defining pranayama, Patanjali's thrust is on observation of the distinct motions of in-breathing and out-breathing. This idea of pranayama is closely similar to the Buddhist notion of anapanasmriti, mindfulness about in-breathing and out-breathing. In the next aphorism, that is in the aphorism Yoga Sutra 2.50, also Patanjali talks about development of pranayama, full observation of breath in terms of space, time, duration, and number, that is frequency. Through this practice, Patanjali holds the breath becomes long and subtle, dirgha sukshma. Secondly, as Patanjali holds in the next aphorism, that is 251, there can also be temporary stoppage of breath, which is natural and not forced. All this is consistent with the Buddhist theory of anapanasmriti, as Asanga discusses in his Shravaka Bhumi. But Vyasa interprets gati vichheda differently. He takes vichheda to mean breaking or destruction and interprets pranayama as the absence of both in-breathing and out-breathing. This is quite inconsistent with Patanjali's usage of the verb vichheda. Vyasa's interpretation is influenced by Hatha Yogic concept of pranayama, in which there is thrust on stopping breathing either inside or outside, rather than passive observation of breathing. Now I come to the fourth discrepancy, four bhavanas or Brahma Viharas, what are called in Buddhism Brahma Viharas. The fourth important theme on which Vyasa's interpretation is discrepant with the original view of Patanjali is the theory of four contemplations or bhavanas, namely Maitri, friendliness or loving kindness, Karuna, compassion, Mudita, appreciative gladness, and Upeksha, equanimity or indifference. Patanjali in Yoga Sutra prescribes the cultivation of the four attitudes as means to the tranquility of mind. As he says, the tranquility of mind is attained through cultivation of friendliness, compassion, gladness, and equanimity or indifference, which have happiness, suffering, merit, and demerit, respectively, as their objects. The cultivation of four attitudes prescribed by Patanjali can be understood on the background of the Buddhist doctrine of four sublime attitudes, Brahma Viharas. Vasubandhu, for instance, formulates contemplation of four sublime attitudes as follows. Maitri, the form of Maitri for him is, may all beings be happy. Sukhita Bata. Then form of Karuna according to him is, oh, all beings are unhappy. Dukhita Bata. The form of Mudita according to Vasubandhu is, may all beings rejoice. Modantam. And the form of Upeksha for him is, there are living beings, Sattva. If we concentrate on the formulations of Maitri and Karuna, it explains in what sense Maitri is about happiness and Karuna is about unhappiness. I suggest that Patanjali also must be having the same idea in mind when he said that Maitri and Karuna are about Sukha and Dukkha respectively. On similar lines, Patanjali seems to have conceptualized Mudita and Upeksha as having merit and demerit, that is Punya and Apunya respectively, as their objects. Accordingly, mudita is the attitude of appreciative gladness towards all the beings in relation to merit they have accumulated, and upeksha is the attitude of indifference or equanimity in relation to the demerit of all beings. According to this interpretation of the four bhavanas, they are the four sublime attitudes towards all beings. Happiness, unhappiness, merit, and demerit are the conditions that all beings possess, including oneself, that is the meditator, and Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, and Upeksha are the sublime attitudes towards all beings with respect to these conditions. In the third chapter of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali refers to the four attitudes again, where he says that through integrated concentration, that is Sanyama, on Maitri and other attitudes, one attains powers, Maitriyadishu Balani. This suggests that the four attitudes can be developed as four powers. On this background, let us consider Vyasa's interpretation of Patanjali's statements regarding the four attitudes. Vyasa has interpreted the aphorism Yoga Sutra 1.33 as follows. There one should practice friendliness towards all those beings who happen to have pleasure and enjoyment. He should practice compassion towards suffering beings. He should practice joy towards meritorious beings and indifference towards those having sinful character. When he practices in this way, there arises right character. By that, the mind becomes tranquil. A tranquil, one-pointed mind attains a stable state. Vyasa's interpretation is obviously different from Patanjali's formulation of the four sublime attitudes. Patanjali says that Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, and Upeksha have Sukha, Dukkha, Punya, and Apunya as their respective objects. Vyasa interprets that they are about Sukhi, Dukhi, Punyavan, and Apunyavan beings respectively. According to Patanjali's formulation, each of the four attitudes is addressed to all beings, whereas according to Vyasa's interpretation, any given attitude is addressed to a specific type of beings and not to all. Patanjali's formulation is closer to Buddhist formulation, according to which the four attitudes are called apramana, that is immeasurable, because of their universal application. Against the universalist formulation of Patanjali, Vyasa's formulation can be called specificist. The difference between the two formulations has an implication to the fourth attitude, namely upeksha. Patanjali says in the aphorism that upeksha has apunya as its object. It can be interpreted as an attitude which can be universally cultivated in relation to the demerit which all beings possess. As a universal attitude, it can also be an object of integrated concentration, that is sanyama. But Vyasa interprets upeksha as indifference towards sinful persons. So the question arises whether its cultivation, that is bhavana, is possible. Vyasa realizes this difficulty while commenting upon Yoga Sutra 3.23, where Patanjali talks of powers arising from integrated concentration on the four attitudes. While commenting upon this aphorism, he accepts the possibility of sanyama on friendliness, compassion, and gladness. But with respect to indifference, he says, that is Vyasa says, the indifference towards the beings of sinful character is not a meditative cultivation. So there is no meditative absorption in indifference. So there is no power arising from indifference. Vyasa's interpretation of four bhavanas in this way is at variance with the original doctrine of Patanjali. There are a few other discrepancies which can be stated here in brief. One, Vyasa's equation of viparyaya with avidya. Two, Vyasa's interpretation of samskara dukkhata. And three, Vyasa's translation of akusida. Now, viparyaya and avidya. Patanjali in Yoga Sutra 1.8 gives two classifications of mental states, chitta vrittis. One classification is twofold classification into defiled and non-defiled, klishta and aklishta mental states. This is a moral cum soteriological classification. The other classification is fivefold: knowledge, erroneous cognition, conceptual construction, deep sleep, and recollection. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smriti. This is a purely epistemological classification. According to the fivefold classification, viparyaya is an erroneous cognition which can occur in any ordinary situation. For example, any optical illusion is a case of viparyaya. However, Vyasa in his commentary identifies viparyaya with avidya. Avidya is a metaphysical misconception which is the cause of all suffering and bondage. Avidya, according to Patanjali, is the root defilement which is intrinsically related to the first classification of mental states, namely defiled and non-defiled. By identifying Viparya with Avidya, Vyasa confuses between epistemological and soteriological classifications of mental states. Now, Samskara Dukkhata, Patanjali in Yoga Sutra 2.15 gives twofold analysis of suffering, one based on Buddhist theory of Triveda Dukkhata and the other based on the Sankhya doctrine of the imbalance between the strands of Prakriti. The third Dukkhata, namely Samskara Dukkhata, is under consideration in this context. According to the Buddhist analysis, Samskara Dukkhata means the unsatisfactory character of all conditioned objects. This fits in Patanjali's framework very well. Vyasa is either not clearly aware of this Buddhist conception or he deliberately wanted to set it aside. So he interprets Patanjali's notion of samskara dukkhata as a suffering caused by latent impressions by going away from Patanjali's intention. And third is akusida. Patanjali in Yoga Sutra 4.29 introduces the notion of dharma megha samadhi, which is a reflection of the 10th plane of the Mahayana Buddhist theory of 10 planes, bhumis. Patanjali says that the yogina attains dharma megha samadhi when he becomes akusida, which actually means non-lethargic or active even after attaining discriminating knowledge. The term akusida is a technical term from Buddhist moral psychology. Vyasa perhaps was not aware of it. He translates the term as at his will as detached, virakta. His translation is not justified by convention. These discrepancies have adverse implications to the thesis that Yoga Sutra and Yoga Bhashya constitute one uniform system. They imply that on many occasions, the author of Yoga Bhashya did not follow the natural meaning of the Yoga Sutra, or maybe he sometimes deliberately deviated from the latter. So I come to the conclusion. In the foregoing discussion, I have tried to do two things. I have tried to show that the yoga system of Patanjali was under a great influence of Buddhism. And secondly, I have tried to show that the Vyasa Bhashya does not always give an authentic interpretation of Yoga Sutra. It was also observed that Yoga Sutra makes a clear and consistent sense if read in the light of Buddhist soteriology. The author of Yoga Bhashya deviates from it either unknowingly or deliberately. Thank you. Now these are some of the something like select bibliography. So thank you very much.
Gitesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. I think today we've had a very long and detailed, philosophically enriching address from a very senior scholar of repute, Professor Gokhale, who shared a very insightful and thought-provoking exploration of views on yoga and Buddhism, while explicating how there are or there had been theoretical influences. I would not make a concluding remark today because quite a lot has been explained, but I would like to say that today's address has opened opportunities for quite a lot of younger scholars to think and reflect upon what Professor Gokhale presented before us. And it will be a wonderful occasion for all of us to pick up a copy of his latest book, because I was just going through certain points that are there in the book, which could be of great use for the budding scholars. Professor Gokhale, we are really honored that you spent time with us on the Spark platform. Thank you, and heartfelt gratitude for sparing time. We have been chasing you since the month of June, and you've spared time today. We're just very happy to have you. So Professor Bala, our research scholars, Ms. Jayashree, Ms. Anmol, and our extended team members consisting of Ms. Megha and Ms. Deepshika, and I thank all the participants for making it today once again to listen to the lecture as well as send us so many questions. We are overloaded with questions today. In fact, some of our participants are asking if they can send the questions further. So herein, I would like to request Professor Gokhale to spare little time to send in the answers to the questions, because we have already received questions through
Yes.
That's a sincere request from our end. So
Surely, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for being so kind and generous. I take this opportunity to thank you all. I wish you all a wonderful day ahead.